Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You can help me by pressing subscribe and sharing it with family and friends. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Alec Taylor from Oceana. Hi Alec.
Hi Jim, how are you doing?
I'm really good, thanks, as I hope you are.
Good, yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to
Thank you. Thank you for that. Before we get into the thick of it, rather than me reading off a list of titles, I think it's more meaningful coming from you directly. For the benefit of our listeners, could you walk us through your background and the path that brought you now to Oceana and the role you play there today?
Yes, absolutely. So I've had quite a mixed path to get to where I am now. I'm currently in the Policy and Research Director at Oceana in the UK. So it's my job essentially to feed in the evidence and the policy to the 3 campaigns that Oceana runs in the UK. So as well as the habitats campaign and the bottom trawling issue that we're talking about today, we also campaign more generally around ending overfishing and supporting the fishing industry to adapt to a more resilient future. And also we campaign against fossil fuel expansion and against bad infrastructure of all kinds. But particularly supporting that energy transition as much as the food transition that we're looking for. I've been at Oceana for about a year. Before that, I've spent around 12 to 13 years in some of the larger marine NGOs. So I've led the marine work at WWF in the UK and previously the RSPB before that. As part of those roles, working a lot on fisheries issues, obviously, and working a lot with fishers and the fishing communities themselves. And for example, up in Filey Bay in Yorkshire, trying to minimise the bycatch of seabirds from gill nets up there, and also convening some of the inshore fisheries and conservation authorities more generally to tackle seabird bycatch. That was a really enjoyable part of my work. I have an economics degree and a marine geography degree, so I bring kind of hopefully some of that economics and the marine environmental sides to Oceana's work. And I also more recently took on at WWF all of the food and farming work as well as the fisheries work, which actually allowed me a really eye-opening opportunity to understand the challenges and the opportunities around the way in which farming is changing in the UK in the face of the climate crisis and the face of the changing policies and legislation that are going through at the moment. And actually, I was quite struck by the fact that not many of us in the farming community or the fishing community, including the NGOs that work on those issues, actually cross over and talk to each other about some of those issues, because obviously they're very different in terms of their industries, but there are some quite strong parallels in terms of issues like resilience and profitability and dignity and issues like that, which I was very lucky to spend a lot of time on the ground with farmers themselves talking about some of their issues. And I was really inspired by the growth, if you like, of a very dynamic and positive movement around nature-friendly farming and regenerative agriculture, led by farmers themselves who have realised that the business-as-usual approach to producing food in this country just was not economically or environmentally sustainable. And hopefully I can take some of those learnings back into the ocean space, because ultimately I am a ocean conservationist at heart. Ocean is my passion. And I'm just very grateful and lucky to be working back in this space and working for Oceana, which is proudly and boldly campaigning for some really positive changes to UK seas.
The part that you said that surprises me a little, you talk about the bigger you mentioned Oceana, and then at some of the, I thought Oceana were massive and global.
Well, globally, they're a large organisation, but in the UK, we are a small team. We were only actually probably about 3 years old as a UK entity, and we have 12 people in this country working on UK issues. So if you compare that to the likes of the RSPB, who have hundreds, if not thousands of staff, or WWF as well, who have hundreds of staff, we are a relatively small NGO in the UK space. We work closely with our Oceania colleagues across the global network, but we are dedicated to UK seas and to improving the state of UK seas. So actually, we are a relatively small organisation when it comes to working on the UK issues that we care about, which is why I think we have that. Hopefully, we have that agility and creativity as much that comes with working within a small network like that.
The other thing which gives me a degree, always a comfort, is you mentioned working with farmers, and I like to hear what the way you put it, almost like you were talking to them, but you were listening as well. And I don't know if you would agree, but I would say I find now we live just on the edge of a farm here. We obviously, the county we live in, there's farming all around us. And with my background in fishing, I would say one of the things fascinates me how fishermen and farmers have in common. They do try to get the best return they can, but they're very, very aware of nature. They'll tell you about the birds, and they'll look at that and watch that and get signs and signals from them. So, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most inspirational times I've been to a farm is when, there's been a songbird, a nightjar or a nightingale, and the farmers have been telling me how much pleasure they get from hearing more birds in their fields as a result of some of those farming changes they've made. And in some ways, it's hard to put a value on that satisfaction from a kind of mental health and well-being perspective as much as from a nature perspective. And ultimately, I don't think any farmer or any fisher is seeking actively to trash the environment in which they are operating in and seeking to make a living in. I think that equally applies across the farming and fishing sector. I've been, as I said, I think there is that recognition in the farming discussions that actually there is a economic case and a social case as much as an environmental case for changing the way we produce food in this country, so that we can bring some of that wildlife back into the heart of our food systems. And actually that is giving those farmers a lot more personal satisfaction as much as maybe the simply hitting the commitments that they've made to protect biodiversity.
Very good. On the film Oceana, what was your gut reaction when you saw the Attenborough piece calling for a full-on ban on bottom trawling?
Generally, when I sat down in the cinema and watched the film, I think I had three instinctive reactions. Firstly, I was obviously immensely impressed by the imagery and the cinematography of the film. I think it's right up there with the films that David Attenborough has done over the course of his career, and the filmmakers deserve a lot of credit for that. Secondly, I was obviously shocked by some of the footage of some of the destruction that was in the film. And even for those of us who work on some of these issues and we read peer-reviewed journals and we understand the impacts, and we talk to people within the communities around those impacts, having that brought to life on screen in such a clear way, even, something that I hadn't seen so powerfully and viscerally before. And the third one, I think, was actually quite a hopeful message, I think, at the end of the film in particular, where we talk about the goals of conservation and the goals of sustainable fisheries being one and the same ultimately. And we have a long way to go, I think, to get to that place in the UK. But ultimately, I think we all want more fish in the sea. We want a healthy ocean, and we want healthy fishing industries operating within those marine ecosystems. And I think that does come through. Obviously, the footage of the destructive fishing has been eye-opening for a lot of people. And obviously, from Oceana's point of view, we're asking for bottom trawling and bottom tow fishing to be removed from marine protected areas. We're not calling for a ban on bottom trawling in general. We're certainly not calling for bottom trawling to be banned in UK waters as a whole. So I think it is obviously raised the public and political.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? If you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. Choose from hundreds of social casino style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Attention of this issue, which I think generally is a good thing. And I recognize some of the concerns that have been made around the way in which, or the lack of nuance and the lack of detail in that film. But ultimately, it is a program about saving ocean wildlife and saving the seas. And the filmmakers themselves, I think, have obviously been on a bit of a journey in terms of putting that program together.
You feel they're trying to ban something they don't understand?
I think I would give them a little bit more credit than that. I think filmmaking in this country, certainly natural filmmaking, has been on a journey. Certainly, for the nature programs that I watched as a child, or even, the films that David Attenborough made in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, I think since then, the nature of those programs has changed. And I think that partly is a result of those people actually witnessing some of the destruction in their own filmmaking, but not able to actually portray that on camera. I was very struck by not the ocean film specifically, but a relatively recent program about filming orangutans in Borneo, actually, and they presented some quite nice looking footage of orangutans and their babies feeding in a healthy looking forest. And in the behind the scenes footage of that filmmaking, it turned out that they had to film that in essentially a preserved human sanctuary, because 80 to 90% of that orangutan habitat had been deforested in order to produce palm oil. And the orangutan populations themselves had been decimated by 80%, 90%. And so I think there has been a shift in terms of actually communicating not just the beauty of the wildlife that we have in the world and in UK seas, but also some of those threats. And so actually, I do think they do understand, I think, some of those impacts. And they are also probably, on the side of public opinion to a large extent, even before the film came out. Polling that we've done for Oceana shows very strong support for restricting this type of damaging fishing inside our marine protected areas network, which ultimately I think is the heart of what we're discussing at the moment and what the Ocean Film has prompted. And there is a public consultation, as you know, about restricting fishing, damaging fishing inside a series of English marine protected areas. And that is the government saying, actually, we probably don't think it's scientifically or politically or publicly acceptable anymore to treat these protected areas in the way that we're doing so at the moment. So I actually give the filmmakers a bit more credit than perhaps you suggest in that sense, Jim. I think they are tapping into an existing public opinion there, and I think they have realised that they have a duty to actually tell the whole story as much as simply showing the beauty of what we have left.
What do you feel about the quote from Professor Ray Tolburn in the distinguished academic in the University of Washington. When he says, a classic of unforeseen consequences. They are a simplistic diversion from the more complex but essential task of managing fisheries better.
Well, I would, obviously, I very much respect Ray Hilburn's work as a scientist. Also, there are equally a very large section of the scientific community that actually is probably in support of what the film is saying. I completely agree. I mean, I would actually share Ray's view that actually one of the central issues that we're talking about at the moment is the way in which the protection of the marine environment, in particular through marine protected areas, has been disconnected and siloed from good fisheries management in general. And actually, I do probably have some sympathy with the view that some of those wider fisheries management issues were not touched upon in the ocean film. But going back to the central question, is it acceptable to be allowing this type of fishing inside the areas which we are legally obliged to protect for nature and which are currently in such a degraded state? Again, for me, that's ultimately the central question that needs to be debated, and I think is being debated quite healthily at the moment through this consultation process in England, and equally has been debated in Scotland as well last year in a recent equivalent consultation. So yeah, a feature-length David Attenborough film, I don't think of any kind, let alone for the ocean, can make all of those points that are needed to drive positive discussions of the nuances of some of those issues. But that does not, in my view, at least, take away the value of what the film has been trying to do, which is to convey not just the beauty of the UK marine environment and the global marine environment, but also some of those stark threats. And I think it's all of our jobs now as practitioners and policymakers and fishers and NGOs to really try and pressure the government for a bit of a vision and strategy for what actually it wants UK seas to look like in 5, 10, 15 years, because we are degrading our marine environment. We are causing the decline of our fishing industry. We are threatening the long-term resilience of our coastal communities. We are not achieving the societal outcomes and the environmental outcomes that we all want. And actually, there are decisions to be made here in terms of things like destructive fishing taking place within those protected areas. And certainly, more broadly, there is a lot of great work going on within the fishing industry, within the fishing community about becoming more environmentally sustainable. Lots of work on trawling, to make trawling itself more selective that I've been interested to read up on. So definitely need to be part of a package. And that's certainly what I am saying to government, in my role, as much as anything else. We have a relatively clear campaign ask to ban trawling within these marine protection areas. But certainly the bigger case for sustainable fisheries more generally is something that we also care deeply about, and which we set out in some of our other work.
What's your view on the film Ocean was launched with royalties, celebrities, and the big NGOs, yet the very people most affected, who hold most of the knowledge and experience, fishermen and fishery scientists, were left out? Why would that be?
Well, firstly, I probably should clarify at this point that Oceana were not involved in any of the filmmaking process or the launch of the film in that sense. So we did not control the editing or the invites to the premiere or anything like that. Having said that, I do think there was a level of scientific advice and expertise provided, and certainly there were some interviews with some small scale fishers as part of that process. I do think there is a point to be made in the representation particularly those aspects, those parts of the fishing fleet that are seeking to become more sustainable, but actually want more support to do so. There's a really powerful voice to be heard there, I think, which is not being heard certainly by governments. And going back to the farming equivalent, we have a very well organized organization called the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which has a whole series of farmers very keen to tell their stories, and they're very well organized, and they've been able to make their case very powerfully to ministers within government meetings as much as anything else. And they are very skilled at communicating their messages in the public domain. It would be fantastic if we had an equivalent organization within the fishing industry to be able to actually, go to filmmakers and film premieres and actually be represented for the great work that they do. So I can't comment specifically on why some of those voices weren't or were invited into the films. That's certainly not something that we were involved with. But I do think the point is well taken about making sure that the voices of those parts of the fishing community are heard, certainly as we follow up from the attention that the film has got.
No, that's fair enough. That's good. Could the public be misled by emotionally charged narrative?
I would not go quite as strong as that, Jim. I think narratives and stories are part of communications and campaigns, and it's not simply the preserve of the environmental sector to pursue those narratives and stories. That is done by many other sectors. It's done by the fishing sector as much as anything else in terms of telling those stories. It's possible to influence public narratives in many different ways. I'm a policy person at heart. I'm a scientist at heart. I do think that good science always should be at the heart of the stories that we tell. But ultimately, I also know that to make change happen, as we're trying to do at Oceana, as I'm sure the fishing industry is trying to do as well, that you do need more than just pure science. You need those emotional connections and those stories to actually, make it clear to the decision makers why this stuff matters. Because in my experience, at least, the facts and the science, they are fundamental to the case that we're trying to make, but they are not going to win the change that we need on their own. And certainly, I think the public do recognize this issue. They are waking up to the fact, I think, that, genuinely, I think there is an opportunity, I think, that this film has provided to really talk about what good ocean management in the UK looks like, that we just haven't had before. We've really struggled to place oceans and ocean issues and fisheries issues higher up into the political agenda. And I certainly can't speak for the fishing industry and how successful they've been in terms of influencing some of those decision makers. But yeah, certainly I think we all need to have this bigger conversation around what the future looks like for UK seas, and actually what do we want fisheries to be managed for in this country. And I hope that we would share some agreement with the fishing industry there, that we don't have that government vision yet, or government leadership for what we want these MPAs to be managed for, or ultimately also what we want fisheries to be managed for into the future.
It's interesting when you say from a scientist. We had a recent podcast with a scientist, fishery scientist, Mark Dickey Colas, and he was ex-ICES. And his point was, he said, I'm an evidence-based scientist or driven scientist, and he doesn't see the evidence.
Well, I have a huge amount of respect for Mark's work, and a huge amount of respect also for the ICES assessments that underpin the advice on catch limits and stock limits, for example. But I would also ask, why is it that every year since we've left the European Union, have we agreed catch limits in excess of that science? So, ultimately, ICES has produced their evidence-based advice. There is a lot of data deficiency in that advice, in which we have to make certain assumptions. But the advice is fairly clear on the amount of fish that we need to catch. But we still see, I think, in the latest, the government's own scientists say that actually probably 56%, I think, of stocks were agreed above the scientific advice last year in terms of their annual catch quotas. So the evidence in some ways is fundamental. And I would also classify myself as an evidence-based scientist in that respect. We put out a piece of work supporting a ban to trawling within MPAs, has 60 plus peer-reviewed papers behind it, supporting that case. But ultimately, even with the best will in the world, certainly in this political environment, I think we also need to make that emotional case and that creative case, if you like, for some of those changes. I know Mark and I probably share the need for things like ecosystem-based management approaches to fisheries, for example, ways in which we can consider marine protected areas together with wider fisheries management and bring some of those discussions together within government. And, I've noticed in issues such as the Northeast Atlantic mackerel journey and the way in which countries, not just the UK, but different countries have mismanaged that stock. That is a political failure. That is not a scientific failure in that sense. And so ultimately, it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to make that political case as well as the scientific case for the change that we want.
Do high-profile documentaries have a duty to show balanced science? Or is good photography and clever storytelling enough to shape public opinion?
I think there is a duty to be as robust as possible with the evidence and the science that you're presenting. Absolutely. Science itself is divided on some of these issues as well.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
So, even within the scientific community, you have a lot of disagreement and discussion around how bottom trawling should be managed, for instance. And actually, I suppose probably are some limits from a filmmaking point of view in terms of how we can get across some of those nuances. We had 20 of the world's leading scientists supporting a ban on bottom trawling in MPAs recently, which I know is not the position of many other scientists who would disagree with that view. So there is a duty to have good science and to have robust science in the production of these programs. Absolutely. And I would certainly not be in favor of a program that is as deeply important as the ocean film is, not having a degree of scientific expertise. I understand that there was a level of scientific advice and scientific and kind of scientists themselves involved in some of the production of the footage and the editing of that program. So there is a duty to show science. There is also the opportunity to convey some of that wider case for change at the same time. And I think, to me, that speaks to the importance of science not existing in isolation from the kind of the everyday lives and the narrative that resonate with people.
Okay. Many feel, and certain people feel Sir David is telling a half story in this. And when you've got the voice of God and a global platform, half a story can be damaging.
Well, again, I think I have a huge amount of respect for Sir David's journey on this, as we talked about a little bit earlier, and also the filmmakers' journey of those that make those films. I cannot speak for the man himself, but I would imagine he has got to a stage in his life and career where he has witnessed, that change in the diversity and the complexity of life that he once saw, which no longer exists. And we have plenty of science to back up the hollowing out of marine ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems over the last 60 to 70 years that David Attenborough has been making programs. That is, we've got plenty of evidence to back that up. So I would gently push back on the idea of David Attenborough only telling a half story in that respect. I think actually his programs increasingly are reflecting probably a greater degree of reality when it comes to the state of the marine environment than perhaps they did before, while also hopefully engendering a sense of hope and optimism that the ocean has this amazing ability to recover and bounce back actually far quicker than the terrestrial environment does. And actually, if we do properly manage some of the human activities that operate in it, and we do so in a way that supports those activities and industries to transition to a more sustainable future, then actually that we can have this win-win situation. And yeah, I think that's probably, I'm certainly not claiming to understand where Sir David is at his point in his life in terms of what he wants to communicate. But I think ultimately the public do need to also know the fact that UK seas and the global ocean in general is in a heavily degraded state.
The half story comes in when you feel like this selective focus. Ocean singles out bottom trawling, but says nothing about other actually more damaging fishing methods, aggregate dredging, seabed mining, offshore wind and industrial cabling. What's your views on that?
Well, I probably would also, I guess, clarify that we've not been involved in any of those choices in terms of what the filmmakers have been showing. Oceana ourselves, we campaign heavily on fighting some of those damaging other human activities, particularly the oil and gas infrastructure. We see that as equally as big a threat to the marine environment as destructive fishing. So we're certainly campaigning more broadly for the end to the most destructive types of human activities in the ocean, whether they're fishing or any other activity. But again, probably the evidence does still suggest that the level of overfishing and the destruction of certain types of fishing remain the primary threat to the health of our ocean. And so I think instinctively that feels like a place to start the discussion. Certainly the evidence shows for the Northeast Atlantic and for UK waters within that there are no seabed habitats in UK waters in good condition, and that bottom tow fishing is the primary threat to those seabed habitats. So in essence, I think, we have to talk about that. We have to have a meaningful conversation about better managing and reducing the pressure of those fisheries. And, in our view, at least, the most natural place to start thinking about reducing that pressure is in the areas which we are supposed to be protecting for nature, those marine protected areas. And certainly, I think that's what we're calling for. Again, certainly not to remove trawling from UK seas as a whole, but I think the mood has shifted in that respect, and certainly in terms of the way that these protected areas are managed, we are now finally starting to talk about things like hold site management, not just the partial protections of individual bits of these areas. And I think that's a really positive step forward. And obviously it comes with challenges and risks in its implementation. And, the industry as a whole needs to be brought on that journey by government as much as possible through incentives, through regulation, through a level playing field with some of the seafood that we import, for example, that may be to lower standards. But yeah, ultimately, I think that the evidence is there to show that that damaging fishing is still one of the primary pressures upon the health of the UK seas.
Does Oceana do anything about aggregate dredging? I was actually horrified to learn that it's done to the thousands of tons for our building industry.
Well, we don't campaign specifically on aggregate extraction at the moment within the UK, Jim. We're aware of it, and we talk about it in the wider sense of things like marine spatial planning for UK seas and how that should be managed. I would say that the actual footprint of aggregate extraction is relatively small in UK waters. I think it's in the region of 100 kilometers squared last year. So when you compare that to the extent of bottom tow fishing, I think the spatial extent is much less for aggregate extraction. I also share your view to some extent. What I wonder why we are extracting these aggregates in the first place and whether there's any other sustainable forms of housing materials that we could produce. But that's not the focus of Oceana's campaigns at this point in time.
Do you not feel it could be, because it must have a far greater impact on the seabed than trawl doors, 2 trawl doors?
Well, again, I would probably speak to the extent of the actual extraction and damage that is being taken place spatially in that respect, Jim. I think the extent of bottom food fishing going on around UK seas, practically speaking, is of a much greater magnitude than the amount of aggregates that are being extracted. That's not to say I think we shouldn't be striving for alternatives to aggregate extraction. And I think there is certainly when it comes to dredging of any kind, I certainly wouldn't be in favour of it. But, ultimately we have to choose our campaigns as we see them. And we do still see the threats of destructive fishing particularly within marine protected areas as the thing that we need to get right.
I'm not talking on behalf of any sector, but I know when you look, he's not Sir David. Yes, he's a great narrator and he's...
Looking for excitement? Chumba Casino is here. Play anytime, play anywhere. Play on the train, play at the store, play at home, play when you're bored. Play today for your chance to win and get daily bonuses when you log in. So what are you waiting for? Don't delay. Chumba Casino is free to play.
Experience social gameplay like never before. Go to Chumba Casino right now to play hundreds of games, including online slots, bingo, Slingo, and more. Live the Chumba life at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Does a great job, but he's not seen as a national treasure in the eyes of the men in oilskins on the deck of a fishing boat. He's the same as another campaigner, and for this, because when back they say other more damaging fishing methods. I mean, you mentioned there about the damage that bottom trawling has done, as if and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but you almost say it like it's as if it's the only method. But you mentioned earlier about your being involved in gill netting in the Yorkshire coast. Well, it's going gill netting and longline up north here. You could say east of Shetland, west of Shetland, right along our north coast, down our west coast, with the EU boats. It's industrial proportions that's going on. And I don't know if you were aware of the recent situation with a boat west of Shetland. He had engine trouble and he was towed into Lerwick. I think it's Lerwick. He was towed into Shetland, and they had to tow him in, so he couldn't hold his gear. So they got a boat and one of their own that was EU, it was, I think, a British-owned flagged boat, and they towed it in. They couldn't get the gear hauled. Marine Scotland were involved. They cautioned them, but they said they weren't satisfied that it was okay. And yes, he couldn't, so he was cautioned, but that's as far as it went. Local, as in Scottish fisherman, feels that he just got a smack in the back of the hand and told he was not to do it again. And that was it left. But Alec, what happened, there was something like 45 mile of netting, ghost fishing for 17 days. It was obviously over the 72-hour soak time, and that's what he was cautioned on. But going from that, I mean, I'm not saying I know exactly what it caught, but if you go by that particular style of boat and they're fishing up there, if you were to take an average of what they normally land and put it into days fishing and multiply it by 17, there's a horrendous tonnage of fish being ghost caught.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we did become aware of that incident, Jim, and it's a hugely underrated issue in the impacts of unsustainable gill netting. And personally, I would really like everybody to be talking about that a lot more. I think for the purposes of this consultation, which is specifically around the seabed protected areas, ultimately that's where some of those bottom-towed gear pressures are the greatest upon those sites, and that's where we think the case for whole site protections are. But I absolutely agree with you, Jim. The issues around gill netting, whether they're bycatch of seabirds or marine mammals, or whether they're discarded fish that are caught as well, it's a hugely underestimated issue for the UK. I remember actually when we were working to set up the special areas of conservation for harbour porpoise about 6 or 7 years ago, actually, in the UK, and some really striking numbers of bycatch of harbour porpoise in UK waters. It's hard to say exactly, but probably at least 1,000, 1,200 harbour porpoises every year continually being caught in gill nets. And that's, I don't have the evidence to know whether that's still the case today, but I think it has gone under people's radar for too long. And I would love it if Oceana and others started talking about that a little bit more. But at the moment, we have a consultation upon us at the moment, which relates to those seabed sites, as I mentioned. And for that, it's really about the fishing gear that makes the most direct contact with the seabed that we're talking about.
A lot of fishermen, trawlermen in Scotland, Alec, would tell you that their method of fishing takes more disused and rejected gill nets and long lines, and they take them. They obviously get caught in their nets, and every one of them takes tons ashore. And just say the bigger ones who are fishing for a week to 10 days, they would take tons of that stuff ashore. We very seldom see that EU boats landing them themselves. It's the biggest concern for a lot of that boats fishing, you could say, west of St Kilda up to west of Shetlands, is ghost fishing and it's, as you know, it's monofilament. It's not going to rot in a hurry. So it's, how long is that going to be catching fish?
Absolutely. And actually those protected areas for mobile species, they are the next stage of this process that we're talking about at the moment. The management of those marine protected areas and the management of fisheries within those marine protected areas. The areas for harbour porpoises, the areas for seabirds, they will be the next part of this program of managing our protected areas. And so gill nets absolutely should be a massive part of that discussion.
Yeah. Another fear we a lot of people know, I'm not saying fishermen only, but people in our area, because let's face it, I mean, Scotland in the past has been renowned for its salmon rivers. And talk about unintended consequence. I mean, a lot of people fear that it's history repeating itself when there's this talk about bans and closures and that. And they look back and they think, well, we had the same campaign with the actresses and models and personalities on the seal campaign, banning seal culls. And what a lot of people, as you drive around Scotland, now see is that in the estuaries, in the mouth of the river, and the tidal, maybe the first mile or so of the tidal section, some of the top, what was the top salmon rivers in the country, there's loads and hundreds of seals, no salmon. Mm-hmm. That's a concern.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think all of us it's incumbent on all of us again to make that message to the government, or all UK governments actually, the Scottish government or the Westminster government, to actually say what is your package of measures to support the measures that you are trying to bring in when it comes to protecting our marine environment. There has been a lot of really good evidence and science produced as part of this process. This is a multi-year process, a lot of stakeholder engagement. The views that are being presented at the moment in terms of the English proposals are the combined views of a lot of very expert UK scientists and the government, of course. That cannot exist in isolation with the engagement with those communities and the stakeholders in terms of making sure that those measures are understood and implemented and can succeed in the long run. And I have, I very much share the view that we cannot simply impose some of these measures from a top-down perspective and expect these communities and stakeholders to simply accept them and comply with them. There needs to be a much wider package of support and understanding of the needs of those communities. And ultimately, I think that is a job for governments and regulators as much as it is for all of us. And certainly that's something that we say quite clearly in our wider messaging around sustainable fisheries, is actually it is this kind of idea of supporting those communities and fishers to transition to a more sustainable future. That takes more than just an MPA management measure. It takes a much more holistic view to listen to and understand the wider needs of those communities. And I think we have had examples where some of that engagement and that early listening to those people has not been done successfully in the pursuit of conservation. But I would also say that this current proposal by the government in relation to England has been a very long-running process. We actually were supposed to have finished it, not just this stage, but the next stage involving the protections for harbour porpoises and seabirds that I mentioned. We were supposed to have done that by the end of last year. So we are already overdue that process. And it's not for me, again, to judge the success by which governments have engaged with communities as part of that process, but there has been, a very deep level of assessment of some of those impacts. And I think the case then becomes, how do you bring it forward in a way that takes as many people with you as possible?
Yeah, even for somebody like myself, though I'm from a small fishing village called Helmsdale in the far northeast of Scotland. And as an example, it's been classed as one of the best salmon rivers in the country, to the point where we've had for many, many years royalty. The now king was Prince Charles. He was up here every year, lots. And when he was married to Princess Diane, they had the house up here. And he was, and there's people in the village who are very proud that they were at the royal wedding, as they call it. They still talk about the royal wedding. Now, what they see as they're protecting a predator. And as I said, and there's it's very, very few salmon left. And from my own perspective, I can see from having been born and brought up in an environment like that, just how important a river is to the economy of a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the shared experiences of farming and fishing, a lot of that shared experience comes from the connection by the water that flows from those inland fields out to the ocean, and then also the pollution that flows out from unsustainable farming practices into the ocean, which is damaging the inshore marine environment upon which some of those communities will depend. I take your point on the salmon issue specifically, but I also do not probably feel personally qualified to give you an expert view or an Oceana position on it at this stage. It's not something that we've looked at in a huge amount of detail yet, but certainly recognise that it is an issue, particularly for some of those communities you mentioned, Jim.
Would you support a blanket ban on all forms of trawling in all UK MPAs? And what's the reasoning behind your position?
Yes, absolutely. I think, that should be fairly clear in our campaigning. We do support a ban on all bottom-towed fishing and destructive fishing in UK marine protected areas. I think I would probably step back a little bit and hopefully set out some sort of evidence around the state of UK seas that would, everybody could agree on. And actually last week, the four UK governments jointly released its updated status of UK seas. And we're now 6 years behind our legal duty to achieve what's called good environmental status or healthy seas. And we're nowhere near achieving that at the moment. And the areas which are flashing red in terms of the worst performing aspects of the marine environment are seabed quality, seafloor integrity as it's called, commercial fisheries, and also seabirds as well. So those are really the key areas where UK is failing to meet its targets to restore the marine environment. As I mentioned, the OSPAR assessments, the regional seas conventions, show that almost all habitats and all seabed habitats in the UK are in poor status, with bottom-towed fishing identified as the main pressure. And if certainly we then turn to marine protected areas, our own analysis showed that actually only 10% of those marine protected areas actually have hold site protections on bottom-towed fishing. So you can, legally conduct bottom trawling in 90% of those sites. And actually there's a kind of a paradigm shift needed, if you like, in the way in which we talk about these marine protected areas, because in England, at least, less than half of those marine protected areas are actually in healthy status. We have fundamentally mismanaged those marine protected areas by pursuing a very narrow piecemeal approach to protecting those areas. And actually, I feel that things are shifting to a more ecosystem-based whole site approach to looking at the management of those sites. And this consultation is part of that journey. And so I certainly think for these particular sites, there's a very clear case. And we've set this out in our reports that we released about a month ago, which sets out the nature case, the climate change case, the economic case as much as anything else. The fact that there are all these natural capital benefits from allowing these areas to thrive again. And also from a kind of taxpayer point of view, there are savings to be made by pursuing these whole site protections rather than just the kind of piecemeal or fragmented protections. And I ultimately, I think at the heart of this message, again, speaking to what we were talking about earlier around where the public is on this issue, I think we have a loss of protected areas on paper. And if you look at the lines on a map, the UK comes out as quite good, certainly in terms of a global perspective. But the reality is that we have this kind of illusion of protection in the UK. We have this veil of protection that's hiding the ongoing destruction of these areas by damaging human activities, not just by fishing, but by other human activities as well. And so I think it's really time to shift that narrative in favor of actually bringing these sites back into healthy status and actually reviving UK seas, which hopefully then can provide the benefits to the fishing industry themselves, whether that's in terms of spillover effects or whether that's just generally in terms of building back the resilience of the UK marine environment. And even for other protected areas, and actually I should also say that this particular consultation is just looking at 42 sites out of 377. So there are many other MBAs as part of this UK network. And I think there is increasingly also a case to be made for restricting these kind of activities, not just for seabed MPAs, but also for other types of MPAs which protect other aspects of the marine environment, whether that's the sedimentation that that trawling produces, which may prevent feeding or communication by mobile species, or by actually just weakening the availability of prey in those areas. So I do support banning bottom trawling in those marine protected areas. We do not support banning bottom trawling altogether. I'm also aware that there's some really good steps being taken within the industry. I know of the Smart Trawl initiative, and by Fisheries Innovation and Sustainability, for example, that's doing some really good work on alternatives to trawling, which we know about. But fundamentally, we need to better protect those areas that we have chosen to safeguard for nature. And I think the realization is starting to grow that we are actually misleading the public by allowing this type of destructive activity to take place within those sites.
When you say for nature, does nature come into the equation? And things like seasonal trends? Because I can remember, it used to be felt that fishing is cyclical. Yes, there would be times when quite not just a seasonal trend, but certain species would take off, as the fishermen called it, and they wouldn't be catching them. Now that could be seen that they fished them out, but they would say they come back on again and they'll start catching them. Now there's an example of that which absolutely fascinates me, Alec. I'll quote it to you. There were two boats fishing in an area called the Murray Firth in the northeast Scotland, and there was a boat listening to them talking, and the two boats were fishing, not pair trawling, but fishing together. One of them held his net, and the other said, I was asking them, how much fish, was there much fish in there? Yes, he says, you got a mixed fishery. And he says, did you see a haddock? That was the conversation. Did you see a haddock? And he come back to him, the other skipper, and says, look, the next haddock you and I see is in a glass case in a museum. And it was my father that told me. And that conversation took place just after the Second World War. And the point he was making was, and they did, no, that was in the east coast of Scotland just after the war. There's more fish there's more haddock in the North Sea just now than they can cope with. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, then, good good fisheries management works, Jim. There's plenty of examples of really successful rebuilding of fish stocks, even if most catch limits are still agreed above the science. There's really positive examples of where wider fisheries management has been successful in bringing some of those populations back. The west of Scotland is another positive example where, generally speaking, we're in a much better place than we were before. And there's really good examples from Lyme Bay, from Sussex Bay and elsewhere where we have managed to integrate trawling restrictions into a wider system of positive fisheries management. I would also say, what more could we have if we properly protect those areas which are important for nature and important potentially also for some of those fish species? What more could we have, rather than also saying what harm are these measures going to do to us? Because I think there is a really positive potential story if we can get it right and integrate some of those protected areas with the ways in which fisheries is managed more broadly, with those other seasonal closures, with the gear modifications, with the wider policy support, with premiums for high quality seafood that the UK produces into the supply chain, for example. There's a package of measures, and actually we set out in one of our other reports, which is called Mission Regeneration, we set out some of that wider agenda. But in my opinion, at least, that still does not negate the need or the opportunity of actually making sure that these protected areas work for nature, which is what they were designed to do. And we're in this really bad situation for everybody in the sense of not having proper management of these areas. It's letting down the fishing industry who don't have certainty about where they can and can't fish. It's letting down those of us who actually want, strong nature protections that deliver proper recovery. And ultimately, it's, as I said, it's almost deceiving the public who actually think we are protecting nature in the marine environment when we are actually not. So in all of those things, I think can and should exist with good, wider fisheries management for the rest of UK seas. So I very much think the two things can go hand in hand. And I am personally quite frustrated by this narrative that the very survival of some of these fishing communities and fishing industries are threatened by the need to bring in good protection measures, as if these areas are, almost the last places left for some of these fishing communities, because ultimately that's a failure of political support for fisheries. At the end of the day, it's not the specific problem of these protected areas being well managed or not. It's the lack of support that governments past and present have given to the fishing sector to make sure that they have enough fish to catch in the ocean, that they're not being undercut by either other activities or by foreign vessels. And actually, it's the lack of that political vision that we were talking about earlier to actually say, we want to support, to support this industry. And actually, we think strong protections in certain places for nature are part of that bigger picture. And I think that's one of the messages I do want to get across is actually, we can have both. We can have good fisheries management and we can have strong MPA protections. But ultimately, I think from our perspective, at least, that starts with the realization that this type of destructive fishing, can't legitimately and legally take place in those protected areas anymore.
What about alternatives to bans, MPAs, seasonal closure, gear innovation?
Yeah, all of those have a role to play, Jim. All of those. If you look at the entirety of UK seas, there's a whole set of tools that regulators or the industry's disposal. As I said, there's some really good work going on. But I come back to the central point of actually, we need to do something different here. We need to be a bit more ambitious, I think, certainly when it comes to the conservation of our marine environment, because we have, spent decades trying to protect parts of our marine environment without much success. We are still declining. UK seas are in such a heavily degraded state. UK fish stocks generally are in a degraded state. We need to start making some bold choices here. And I think this is an example of a bold choice, and it's going to cause a lot of debate and discussion. And I think that is healthy debate. And I think that's why I wanted to take part in this podcast as much as anything else, Jim, to be part of that discussion. And we have a public consultation process that everybody can feed into to understand the pros and cons of bringing these measures forward. But, I think it's a positive thing that this discussion is happening. And I think we have been tinkering around the edges of marine protection for far too long now, and we just haven't been making the gains that we all want to see. And I do think that we need to start thinking a bit differently going forward.
Here's a conversation I had just last week with a fisherman I've been friendly with for many years. And he fishes up the north here and east, more east. And he, in this area called the Murray Firth, this guy was the first, he's like a pioneer. He started there was a squid fishing, and he pretty much was the first, to do it. And what his conversation, it's funny, it's just come to my mind, Alec, as you talk. He was talking about when he started squid fishing, which is quite a number of years ago now. He says he was getting a good fishing, and he says all round about us there was lots of bird life, minke whales, porpoises, dolphins. He says it was just amazing. There's so much life, and they were getting a good fishing. And he said he goes now, and the area is full of wind farms, windmills. And he said there's seals round the legs and the wind farms, and obviously there was oil rigs there as well. And they never see a bird, they never see a whale or dolphin or anything like that now, and they very seldom see any squid. Now, I'm just saying that, I'm not challenging you, Alec. I'm just, you can understand what he sees.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, great to hear the memories that he has of that wildlife coexisting with healthy fisheries. That's ultimately a shared view that, a shared vision for what we want to see as much as anything else. Certainly we also have some concerns about the ways in which some energy developments have been put in inappropriate places and constructed in inappropriate ways. That's a much wider discussion that we're also taking part in. What is the bigger, spatial strategy, if you like, for actually making sure that we have enough renewable energy in the right places in ways that, we can work with fisheries and with nature conservation as much as anything else. I know that the government have recognized that in England, at least. There is a marine spatial prioritization program, which the fishing industry is very much part of, talking about some of those trade-offs. And that's, ultimately, I think that's a crucial discussion to be having, especially as we start phasing out some of those oil and gas developments, as you touched on there.
Isn't there a danger that banning bottom trawling here in the UK doesn't stop demand, it just pushes it off to someone else?
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
that when imported into this country from a country with far worse practices, and pretend it's progress. We could be adding air freight, cargo shipping, the carbon footprint to that would be pretty alarming, and it's still trawl caught. So it's just, is there any logic in that?
Again, I probably would just clarify that we are not talking about banning trawling completely from UK waters here. The proposal is to ban trawling from specific areas which are legally designed to protect nature. So there are opportunities to still catch trawled caught seafood for UK markets within the UK, and hopefully, in my view at least, the introduction of these measures would actually support some of those species to recover as much as anything else. So hopefully there's a positive story to be told there. I do think there is a wider point around the extent of the seafood that we export and the seafood that we import that ends up on people's plates there. So there's also a discussion to be had around how do we improve the accessibility of the UK public to some of the UK caught seafood, and how do we ensure that fishers receive a really good premium for high quality seafood that we catch in this country? Because ultimately we are exporting 75% of the seafood that we catch, and we're importing 80%, 85% of it. So actually, from a kind of demand point of view, all of that demand currently is coming from overseas in the first place. And actually, one of the things that we're also calling for is actually for a level playing field in terms of the standards of some of that seafood that is imported, that is, equivalent to the kind of standards that we would expect of UK fishermen, because there is that concern that you would be undercut by seafood that is produced to lower standards overseas. Ultimately, the reality is that, a lot of our seafood that is caught by bottom good gear is currently exported anyway. And so I think there's a wider point to be made around actually improving the supply chains and the markets to allow UK citizens to access and to enjoy the amazing UK seafood that we do produce. And actually, I think restricting some trawling in those protected areas for nature, hopefully, makes a positive difference to that, allow some of those species to recover, to allow some of those fish populations to rebuild gradually. And actually, we can probably tell a positive story about some of that UK seafood.
I'm right with you there, Alec. I think that maybe put it slightly different, but we're saying the same thing. I feel that the shoreside, the market, and that they have a responsibility as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, I did a lot of work on some of those supply chains when I was at WWF actually, because ultimately if whether it's fishermen or farmers, if they're not getting paid a fair price for the food that they're producing, and there is no distinction in the supply chain between food that is produced in an environmentally sustainable way to that which is not, then what is the incentive for those food producers to actually make some of those changes if they're not getting a fair return in the market? And so ultimately that's a responsibility as much on the supply chain as it is on government. But at the end of the day, government does have the opportunity and the duty to set that regulatory playing field, if you like, to make sure that those supply chains operate responsibly, and also that we have good management measures in place for those protected areas as well.
What do you see as the biggest consequences both of banning trawling in MPAs and not banning it? What's at stake either way?
Good question. In terms of what's at stake, I think the health of those areas specifically, and the health of UK seas as a whole, I think is at stake. I think we are, those areas are operating on life support at the moment in many cases. They're certainly not achieving the objective that they're setting out. And so we do need to start properly thinking about whether we actually want these areas to succeed or not, and how we do that in a way that that works for everybody. There are consequences of bringing in those measures that I absolutely recognise. Issues like displacing fishing activity potentially into other areas. I would also suggest that, that's not an automatic consequence of strong protected area management. There are actions that governments can bring in, or actions that the industry themselves can take to mitigate some of that displacement. Although I do recognise it is a concern. But to date, at least, I think the governments around the UK have been very passive in just assuming that all of this fishing activity will simply move elsewhere. And I think there are ways in which we can mitigate that. And I think it speaks to the idea of this kind of just transition as well, Jim. This idea that actually there's a really positive long-term future to be had if we take some of these steps, but there will be a period of transition in the short term. There will be an adjustment period, and the crucial thing is how that adjustment period works. If especially there are immediate term impacts to the fishing industry from bringing in some of these measures, which could be the case, then actually how is that industry going to be supported more widely? And again, going back to these MPA measures not existing in isolation from wider support for those parts of the sector to transition. Again, we can talk about finance there. We could talk about regulation. We could talk about incentives in other ways. So I think that ultimately, what's at stake is the resilience of the marine environment and the resilience of those fishing industries and communities that operate within it. And I see with great sadness the declines in the marine environment that I'm seeing, but also the struggles that the fishing communities themselves are facing. And I think there has to be a better way forward that hopefully can bring some of those together.
I take what you're saying, Alec, and I detect from it, I take out of the way you're between the lines, you could say, or behind it. I don't think you see it all as negative.
I think there's a really positive story to be told here. And we need to tell it in a evidence-based and a honest and a transparent way. And, certainly once the peak of the ocean film has died back, we won't have an ocean film every year when we talk about the future of the marine environment. It's incumbent on Oceana, it's incumbent on all of us to actually approach that conversation in a positive and solutions focused way. And we do, I think there is a message of optimism here that actually, if we allow these areas of the sea to replenish and to rebound, then I think we can tell a positive story. And that, all of us should be telling our governments and our elected representatives that actually there's a case to be made here if we can essentially manage the implementation phase of these measures in such a way that we support those affected as much as possible.
Is there any real common ground between the fishing industry and NGO campaigning to ban bottom trawling in the MPAs? And if so, how could it be used to find a practical way forward?
I like to think there is, Jim. I know you had Sarah Coulthard on your show recently, and we've talked a lot with Sarah and others about this common grounds. We share completely the view that there is no vision or strategy from government around the future of fishing. There is a siloed approach to nature conservation and fisheries management that we need to overcome, that goes right up to the top of government. The fact that we have different ministers for fisheries as we do for the marine environment. I think there is a general agreement on the need for this just transition to a more sustainable future. and the need to support communities and industries in what is a very uncertain period, generally. And so, ultimately, I hope that we could agree on a vision for fisheries that is based on some core principles around science, around respect, around resilience, around transparency. And actually, we can go forward with some of those common principles together and discuss, how we can co-create a shared future. I think that's for all of us to move forward together. So I think there is more common ground than actually we might realize here, and I'm very keen that we try to strike that ground as much as possible while being able to disagree on some of the other things that we might have differences of opinion on.
Do you see being able to do that and ensure that science stays at the heart of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I am confident that we can do that, Jim. We have a very healthy scientific debate going on at the moment on this issue. There's a spectrum in terms of the evidence and the opinions within the scientific community. I recognize that. I recognize that others take a different view on that, but ultimately, they are all legitimate opinions that we need to bring to the table. It's for governments and the regulators to decide on their best approach to managing these areas in particular. But certainly, there's a lot that we can all do as a wider ecosystem of stakeholders to make sure that we are calling for the proper support for the fishing sector to take advantage of some of these protections if they are put in place, to actually make sure that we catch fish populations in line with the science, to actually make sure that we have we actually know who's fishing where, and actually if there's illegality in the system that we can root this out effectively. Issues like that, which Oceana also works on a lot, in terms of things like fisheries transparency and monitoring of vessel activity. So I think that, there's hopefully some common principles of what good fisheries management looks like that we would agree on. And I think, strong and healthy protected areas, acting as the beating hearts of a healthy marine environment actually should be one of those solutions that I think hopefully we can move forward with.
Referring to when you talk about earlier about bigger NGOs, and I was saying I was surprised because I thought Oceana was, and you explained in a UK basis. Do you feel, as this goes on, will Oceana be in the conversation
about the future of UK seas?
Yeah, and in discussions and meetings ongoing and that with various fisheries groups and.
Absolutely, yeah. We're deeply committed to working on fisheries issues in the UK as much as we are in other parts of the world. Good fisheries and rebuilding fisheries populations are at the heart of what Oceana works on in all our offices, actually. So for us at the moment, it's more a question of capacity than it is of intent. I am the policy person.
I'm not questioning your principles or anything. What I mean with a comment you made earlier about other bigger ones, is Oceana big enough to be recognised and be in the conversation?
Yeah, certainly. We are in coalitions with those bigger NGOs and other stakeholder groups. We try to play an active part in some of those policy discussions as best as we can. So we do collaborate and align with those other NGOs who are taking part in those discussions. Absolutely.
Okay. I asked AI to pick a question for this series, a challenge to Attenborough. If you had 5 minutes face-to-face with Sir David, what would you say?
Well, I think firstly I would, having not met him personally yet, I would thank him for his years of education and awareness raising for the general public. I would thank him deeply for the influence that he has had on so many people, and the attention that he has brought to one of the most defining issues of our time, which is the status of our natural environment. I probably wouldn't want to disturb him too much myself personally, so I probably would simply say, thank you very much. We are working with you. We hope that you also understand the fact that implementing these things is difficult, and there are in some ways no easy solutions or silver bullets to some of the things that you talk about, and we're here to put those into practice. But at the end of the day, he has made such an enormous contribution to the state of natural history filmmaking that I think I would probably simply be happy to just thank him for that.
Well, I have to say I like your answer, and especially one word. I like your style. Yet. You haven't met him yet. You obviously think...
No, hopefully this might be... I know. Well, hopefully there might be an opportunity to do so in future. I mean, I'm amazed at how busy he is and how active he's working at such a late stage of his life. Again, that is also an inspirational thing for all of us, I think. So who knows?
Well, that was the other point that was in my mind when you said "yet." It made it sound like you're one day going to meet him. But with all due respect to Sir David, I would say at 99, you need to get a move on.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly probably not the top of his list of people to meet, and there's I'd be fighting a very competitive field to get an audience with Sir David's. But I think he's been an inspiration for me, obviously for many others who are working in the sector, and I think he's obviously felt a need to communicate some of those broader messages as he gets older, which I think is an important part of his career.
Which book or article do you think everyone in fisheries should read?
I'm going to pick a couple. Firstly, from my Oceana policy perspective, I would encourage everybody to look out for a report called Mission Regeneration. I mentioned it briefly earlier, but essentially that is our broader vision for good fisheries management in the UK. And it's also the case that we were discussing earlier around some of those shared outcomes that we want in terms of political leadership, a plan to end overfishing and support the fishing industry, some of those core principles that I talked about in terms of respect and science and transparency. So Mission Regeneration, you can find that on, not in all good bookshops, but certainly on the Oceana website. Certainly from a personal point of view, the books that have really inspired me, there's an author called Philip Hoare, which you might know, Jim, who's done a couple of brilliant books about the sea, one of them about whales, called the cetacean rather than the country, the Leviathan, and the other one called The Sea Inside. Both of those speak very powerfully to some of the kind of the movements of historical and cultural and scientific attitudes to the sea over time, and his connection to those narratives. So if anybody hasn't read Into the Sea Inside or Leviathan by Philip Gore, those would be my 2 recommendations.
Okay, thank you. That's good. One word to describe the future of British fisheries.
Hopeful, I think, if we can get this right. I recognise the uncertainties and the insecurities and the vulnerabilities that many in the sector are facing at the moment. I completely empathise and sympathise with that. But I do think we are turning a corner, certainly in the way in which we talk about ocean issues at the moment. And I do feel hopeful still that we can reverse some of these declines that we're seeing and actually have a future not just full of fish, but also full of the other amazing wildlife that the UK sees has the potential to accommodate. And I very much hope that we can collectively raise that together in the minds of government to actually, drive that as a shared vision for the future.
That's a good word. I like that. I like anything with a positive slant to it. Where can our listeners follow you online, Alec?
I am mainly on LinkedIn these days, so you can hopefully find me on LinkedIn there. I try to post fairly regularly about various issues there. I'm actually not on many of the other social channels, and I've never joined Instagram. I've took myself off X or Twitter, but obviously the Oceana social media is also available. But certainly, LinkedIn is a good place to find me, and obviously feel free to also contact me through there if anybody has any wishes to discuss more.
Thank you. I think that will be a good way to fold it, and I would thank you so much. I like your positive approach to the conversation and the future. Alec, thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for this series of discussions, Jim. And thank you for inviting Oceana to be part of them. And I hope the rest of them go well. And let's continue that discussion going forward.
It's nice to get all sides together. Yeah, thank you.